Hey, you wanna see something cool? The Storybook games aren't much of a series as there were only 2 installments, Sonic and the Secret Rings and Sonic and the Black Knight. The idea behind these games was to retell classic literature within the Sonic universe. For example, Sonic and the Secret Rings was a spin on 1001 Nights, referred to as the Arabian Nights in-game. There's a ton to love about Secret Rings, from its premise to its music, and obviously to its presentation. Unfortunately, the one aspect of it I cannot stand is the game itself. For some reason, the Storybook games are on-rail platformers. This is odd to me because on-rail games take away a significant amount of control from the player by design. It's appropriate for that genre of games and not so much for platformers. Sega did improve upon this style of gameplay in Sonic and the Black Knight, but ultimately it still suffered from many of the same problems as Secret Rings, just to a lesser degree. As for the other aspects of Black Knight, wow, this game's story, presentation, and music blow Secret Rings out of the water. It's for these reasons, if I were to have a conversation with someone and they were to claim Black Knight was one of their favorite Sonic outings, I could totally understand why. However, that doesn't mean I would believe the same, nor even consider Black Knight good for that matter. When I was younger, I'd constantly catch commercials for the Storybook games on television, and for the longest time, I thought it was a spin-off series of RPGs. It wasn't until middle school I discovered this wasn't the case. What piqued my interest in the Storybook series today was the concept behind it. Since I've spent a lot of time reading classic literature, I've come to develop a deep appreciation for it. That's why I adore inventive retellings of classic stories. Being able to take an iconic narrative and transform it into something entirely new is a wild, exciting concept to me. This is exactly what the Storybook series aimed to accomplish. Video games are a medium unlike any other because of their interactivity. Films and novels are somewhat restrictive because they can only last so long before the audience loses interest. As proof, it's typical for artists to deviate from their original vision for the sake of making their respective product as easily consumable as possible, only retaining what the audience absolutely needs to experience. I think video games have some leeway in this regard since the experience is entirely dependent on the audience. People aren't passively watching or reading, but actively interacting with the piece in order to finish the narrative. Taking stories told in those semi-limited mediums, then retelling them in a video game is a wonderful idea, because it allows for those worlds to be further explored. I consider RPGs to be the genre of game best suited to this, as they're typically experiences that can be tailored by the player. The path your character takes and where the story ends is dictated by you. Additionally, world building in novels can become insanely intricate, but because the focus of the story is on a single protagonist, that world is usually never fully explored. In an RPG, characters and ideas that were only briefly present in the original story could be turned into full-on quests and storylines. When you really think about it, that's the genre best suited for the Storybook series. I think it just makes sense. Sonic and the Secret Rings and Sonic and the Black Knight are phenomenal ideas executed poorly, and after playing through the two, I wanted to discuss that. As I've said before, I hate producing negative content. It requires me to dedicate too much towards crafting a product that makes me miserable. So there was no way I'd even work on a Storybook video if it was a straight up review. Instead, I've decided to use the small platform I've built for myself to do something a little bit different and present you all with a game pitch. Sonic is still, in every sense, a video game icon, and yet sometimes it doesn't really feel like he's being treated as such. Nowadays, the franchise is composed solely of mainline games with the occasional kart racing spin-off. On the flip side, in the early 2000s, Sega was publishing Sonic spin-offs left and right. We got Sonic Shuffle, Battle, Riders, Chronicles, and of course, the Sonic Storybook series. I believe spin-offs are important because they provide developers with creative freedom. The option to throw whatever the hell they want at the wall to see if it sticks. This creative freedom should then go on to relieve developers from creative fatigue. I'd imagine developing the same kind of game over and over again gets tiresome very quickly, and if the people working on a franchise barely want to work on any new titles, it's understandable the quality of their work suffers. This is why I feel it'd be much easier for the series to find its footing if spin-offs were reintroduced. They're just as important to the franchise as its main titles. This video is the start of a mini-series where I take a look at a certain Sonic spin-off and attempt to reinvent it in a way that transforms it into the best game it can possibly be while staying true to its spin-off nature and that unmistakable Sonic attitude.
Ready, Sonic?
You know it!
I've noticed a very hot topic within this community is how Sonic is or should be portrayed. I've also noticed that a lot of the people partaking in this debate aren't writers because it clearly shows. I don't say this for the sake of being crass or dismissive, as I do believe the opinion of the general audience is important, but because just like any other craft, there are very technical aspects to writing stories and creating characters. In other words, objectivity can be applied to these conversations to some degree. And with that being said, Sonic the Hedgehog should never be given a character arc because he isn't a round character. Sonic is entirely symbolic, a character whose purpose within a narrative is to be representative of a greater and more ambiguous idea. Thus, to force a symbolic character to change is to risk transforming them into an entity entirely different from what they're meant to represent. Case in point, let's take Aslan from the Chronicles of Narnia. In Narnia, Aslan is basically Jesus Christ, who is symbolic in himself. There was no insecurity for Christ to overcome since he was born a saint. Jesus Christ is just Jesus Christ. Tying this back to Narnia, imagine how lost that symbol would be if C.S. Lewis instead opted to write Aslan dynamically. If the lion had any flaws to overcome, he couldn't have been symbolic of Christ, and Aslan would have no purpose to fulfill within the narrative. So, what is Sonic symbolic of? Don't just sit there and waste your precious time. When you want to do something, do it right away. Do it when you can. It's the only way to live a life without regrets. To live a life of power, you must have faith that what you believe is right, even if others tell you you're wrong. The first thing you must do to live a life of power is to find courage. You must be ready to reach beyond the boundaries of time itself. And to do that, all you need is the will to take that first step. Sonic races through the green fields. The sun races through a blue sky filled with clouds. The ways of his heart are much like the sun. Sonic runs and rests. The sun rises and rests. Don't give up on the sun. Don't make the sun laugh at you. The quotes from the Japanese box arts for the original Sonic games provide vital insight to how the creators of this character interpreted him during his formative years. I think it's clear these are all lessons being imparted from Sonic onto the player about living life, and more specifically, about living your life free from any regrets. Sonic the Hedgehog is symbolic of the freedom of self, the ability to live life however one sees fit. With that, I hope it becomes clear why Sonic shouldn't be given a character arc, because if he has some crippling flaw he's actively working to overcome, then he's not living life faithful to his own credo. The ways of his heart are much like the sun. Sonic runs and rests. The sun rises and rests. Sonic has insecurities, but he's truly not the type to let them tie him down. Ultimately, if those insecurities aren't an issue, then there isn't any arc to be written. I believe this is the reason why the Sonic franchise has such a large supporting cast. In order to tell a complex narrative, there has to be some kind of round, dynamic character at its center, and if that isn't Sonic, then who is it? A supporting character. I'm not sure if this is the best way to put it, but while I consider Sonic to be the main character of the series, I don't think that necessarily makes him the primary focus of each game. Let's take Sonic Adventure as an example, because if anyone's the lead protagonist, it's Tikal. The central story revolves around her and the Echidna tribe's connection to the water god Chaos. Sonic is simply a means to quell the heart of the creature and bring it into Tikal peace. Sonic Adventure 2 is entirely Shadow's story. Sonic becomes a fugitive because of Shadow. The Chaos Emeralds are gathered because of Shadow. And the Space Colony arc is reactivated, then the gang goes into space because of Shadow. Everything in SA2 revolves around Shadow and his character. Extending this even further, I'd consider Sonic 06 Elise's and Silver's story, and Unleashed Chip's story. In a lot of these narratives, Sonic's role is just that of a foil, a character who serves to challenge certain aspects of the protagonist through comparison. As proof, Shadow was literally designed to be Sonic's foil, in turn making Sonic his. Shadow's entire motivation in SA2 is to fulfill a promise made 50 years ago. One character is all about living in the present and making the most of today, while the other is shackled to days long past. Ironically, the focus of Sonic's story in 06 isn't himself, but Princess Elise, where he only serves to foil her bad habit of worrying about what's yet to come, admonishing that if there's time to worry about the future, then there's still time to change it. I've made a lot of points in a very short amount of time, so just to reiterate, Sonic is a symbolic character representative of the freedom of self. He shouldn't be given any major character arc because by doing so, you risk losing that symbol, thus voiding Sonic's role in a narrative. Typically, that role is to act as a foil to the ideals of another character in order to clearly convey a message about freedom or any larger idea relating to the series by the story's conclusion. Now then, please allow me to explain why I believe Sonic in the Black Knight is one of the better examples of this. Sonic in the Black Knight opens on a confrontation between a female wizard and what seems to be the game's titular Black Knight. The knight corners the wizard by summoning armor-clad reinforcements from the underworld, which forces her to call upon the aid of a being from another world, Sonic. After arriving on the scene, Sonic quickly recognizes the severity of the predicament the wizard has found herself in, so provides an opening for the two to escape. Once out of the knight's reach, the wizard reveals her name to be Merlina, and the knight to be King Arthur, King of Camelot and the leader of the Knights of the Round Table. Merlina then goes on to explain that through the power of Excalibur's enchanted scabbard, King Arthur achieved immortality, then summoned an army from the underworld, plunging his kingdom into disorder. Sonic is obviously eager to defeat King Arthur, but before he can, he must recover the sacred sword in the stone, Caliburn. Much to Sonic's surprise, Caliburn isn't just a sword or the means to King Arthur's end, but also the only being within this world truly capable of giving his mouth a run for its money.
The sacred sword.
It goes by the name Caliburn.
That's kinda sorry looking. Fool! Ah!
You are the chosen one. You are but a squire.
Oh yeah? Says you.
The sword has a mind of its own. It selects its bearer.
Yeah, well, it's got a pretty smart mouth on it for a sword.
The impertinent one is you, knave. Brace yourself, for I shall train you until you are worthy.
All right, Professor. Work your magic.
Once Sonic and Caliburn have become well acquainted with one another, they journey to meet Nemu, the Lady of the Lake, who reveals King Arthur's immortality could be nullified through the combined power of the other three sacred swords, each wielded by a Knight of the Round Table. At this point in the story, Sonic and Caliburn have already defeated Sir Lancelot and Sir Gawain, so they head off to defeat Sir Percival, then King Arthur himself in Avalon. After using the power of the sacred swords to nullify the effects of Excalibur's scabbard, Sonic finally defeats King Arthur, but instead of him dying, I guess, Arthur simply vanishes in a plume of smoke similar to the aforementioned Knights of the Underworld. Sonic and Caliburn reconvene with Merlina at Camelot Castle, where she has been cornered by the Knights of the Round Table. After detailing the curious circumstances of the villain's demise, Sonic hands Merlina his scabbard, only for her to reveal King Arthur was nothing more than one of her grandfather Merlin's illusions. She declares she'll use the power of Excalibur's scabbard to make the kingdom immortal, correcting what she believes believes to be Merlin's greatest mistake. Overwhelmed by Merlina and her new power, Sonic and the Knights retreat from Camelot and are then met by Nemu at the kingdom's outskirts. According to her, a barrier to contain this dark energy can be created by placing each sacred sword into sacred stones scattered across the region, prompting the swordsman to scatter. Tragically, once the swords are in position, the barrier is far too weak to hold her influence.
Now's the time.
Indeed.
Here we go!
Yet miraculously presents Sonic with an opportunity to enter the Dark Hollow and confront Merlina. As if she's familiar with the Arthurian legend herself, Merlina is fully aware the Kingdom of Camelot and the Knights of the Round Table are all doomed to perish. She believes her grandfather's foe, King Arthur, was a foolishly naive attempt to solve a problem all too complex in nature, and that the Kingdom of Camelot can only be saved through her granting it immortality. Indifferent to her machination, Sonic rushes to stop this new Dark Queen, but to no avail. With all hope seemingly lost, the Knights of the Round Table plead with him to concede and disregard any thread of chivalry he may be clasping onto, only for Sonic to proclaim he hasn't been fighting to adhere to knighthood, but instead to simply do what he believes is right. It's at this moment, the true light of the sacred swords reveals itself, giving birth to the holy sword Excalibur. With this power, Sonic is able to defeat the Dark Queen Merlina and restore order to the Kingdom of Camelot. So I've witnessed a fair amount of people express how their distaste for the storybook series results from those games not being congruent with the rest of the Sonic canon. To put it differently, these adventures aren't Sonic. I'm not even going to try and refute this claim because I think it's an entirely fair perspective to have. 1001 Nights and the Arthurian legend are stories that were developed and written centuries before Sonic was even conceived. If you take a classic story from any time period, then adapt it to fit another, developed years or even centuries after, there's bound to be at least some surface level discrepancy. However, this is the very reason why the storybook series is so interesting. Sonic doesn't belong in these stories, and Sega used that to their advantage. The Arthurian legend is one of those tales that's seen mindless retelling one after the other. What I appreciate the most about Black Knight's narrative is it's an Arthurian retelling that truly does something unique with the tale. Sonic and the Black Knight is only loosely based on the legend of King Arthur, so thoroughly summarizing that legend isn't required for y'all to understand most of the points I'm about to present. To start, after she and Sonic initially escape his clutches, Merlina refers to King Arthur as a once wise and just ruler, corrupted by the immortality granted to him with Excalibur's scabbard. I believe the Black Knight in the game's subtitle is in reference to him, just not in a literal sense. Arthur's armor is dark, but it's not black, and instead a very dirty gold. So, alternatively, the subtitle is relative to Arthur's illusion's role as the Black Knight literary stock character. These characters are typically antagonistic in nature and are depicted as knights who fail to display any signs of lineage nor reveal their identities. Furthermore, the anonymity of Black Knights is a product of their questionable character. In a sense, the Black Knight is also the anti-knight, or a figure who stands in opposition of the ironclad character of the traditional knight. For future reference, I will be referring to this traditional knight as a knight errant, a nomadic knight in pursuit of adventure as a way to affirm his chivalric ideals, which can be accomplished through pure idealism or through courting a maiden.
But Mono, that's Joan of Arc. How could she be both the knight and the maiden?
Because she's pretty cool. Anyway, moving on. Many Arthurian retellings feature a Black Knight within its plot, but I cannot think of many in which the Black Knight is the king himself. Yes, Arthur's illusion is still the king of Camelot, so in this instance he does hold some kind of allegiance, but by crafting a scenario in which he abandons his own ideals to begin terrorizing the very land in which he rules, I believe he does become that villainous Black Knight. It's a very minor revision, but because of the character's significance, it shifts the narrative entirely. Now, Now, the question is, if King Arthur is the villain of the story, then how exactly does this count as an Arthurian tale? A point of contention among many when remaking a piece or continuing pre-existing material is whether the new iteration will stay faithful to its predecessors. I'm not against revitalizing old ideas, but I do hold the belief that certain aspects of the works in question must remain the same in a bid to respect the intentions of the original creators. For instance, let's take Sonic's initial design for the 2020 movie, as it's a shining example of why my previous statement should be the standard. The hard truth is that The Legend of King Arthur and Sonic the Hedgehog as a series and character are popular for a reason, so there are facets of their larger design that shouldn't change for the sake of making them fresher or more accessible. By doing so regardless, I hold the belief you're implying your vision is a vast improvement over what's been proven to work just fine. In King Arthur's case, there are certain aspects of that story which should never be changed, like Arthur being chosen for the crown to wield Excalibur and its focus on exploring knighthood and chivalry. Those elements compose the very foundation of this narrative, so by altering them you're effectively telling an entirely different story. Thankfully, Sonic and the Black Knight is faithful to that foundation, resulting in a true revitalization of a pre-existing work. First, Sonic begins his adventure by retrieving the sacred sword resting in stone. Second, Sonic goes on to wield Caliburn throughout his entire adventure, eventually meeting the conditions for it to shape into its true form, Excalibur. Finally, by the game's finale, Sonic is revealed to be the one and true King Arthur, since, as the legend details, the king is deemed worthy by accomplishing the feat of pulling the sword from the stone. When this initially happens, there isn't any major focus on Sonic nor the act. I think this works to the narrative's benefit, as the scene instead serves as a form of foreshadowing to the big reveal during Black Knight's denouement. After beating the game, it became wholly apparent to me that the story beats, among others, were pointing towards Sonic being the true King Arthur. To show you what I mean, if the hero-king shift in nature wasn't a major tip-off, you also have the aforementioned events, Nemu providing Sonic with information pivotal to defeating King Arthur's illusion and awakening Excalibur. So in a way, she still bestows Arthur with its power, just like in the legend. And while this may be a stretch, Caliburn being more of a catalyst to Excalibur rather than the Holy Blade itself could be a clever twist on how the Sword in the Stone and the Greatest Sacred Sword were two different weapons originally. Considering in this iteration, Excalibur is only revealed through the mark of a true hero, it couldn't have been handed to Sonic by Nemu, which is probably why she only gave Arthur's illusion its scabbard. Ultimately, none of the foundational elements I outlined earlier were infringed upon because King Arthur was never the villain of this tale, as Sonic was the true King Arthur all along. On that note, it's time we discussed Sonic's curious inclusion in all of this. Earlier, I argued Sega took full advantage of Sonic's distinct presence within the storybook titles, which is made most apparent in Black Knight. To further illustrate this point, before Merlina is revealed to be the true antagonist of this adventure, Sonic spends a majority of his time pursuing the Knights of the Round Table in preparation for his eventual rematch with King Arthur's illusion. It's during these encounters the juxtaposition between Sonic and the world he's attempting to save rears its head. To preface this explanation, knights are often romanticized in the media, which is understandable, as the general concept of knighthood and chivalry are wildly intriguing. Devoting oneself wholly to an individual, country, or set of ideals is admirable, and I find myself swooning over the idea whenever it presents itself. The issue with this level of devotion is one running the risk of sacrificing their individualism, even going as far as to commit suicide upon the failure to uphold their duties towards said individual, country, nor ideals. It's with this Sonic's issues in regards to the chivalric code arise, and his ideological clash with the Knights of the Round Table begin. Sonic's confrontation with Lancelot is fairly tame, as the knight only provides physical opposition, so after Sonic defeats him, that's the end of that. His duel with Gawain, however, is an entirely different story. Upon his defeat, Gawain professes he's failed as a knight and attempts to take his own life in order to salvage what remains of his honor. Sonic stops this and expresses to Gawain that being a knight must mean much more than just serving a king. This back and forth between Sonic and the knights continues until after their final confrontation with the Dark Queen Merlina, and with the eventual revelation that Sonic is the one true King Arthur. The takeaway from these interactions and relationships is just what I said before. It's fine to dedicate yourself to a cause in doing what you believe to be right, but if that begins to impose on your individuality and self-worth, then that knighthood becomes detrimental to your person. This is such a unique criticism on this line line of thinking, so I have to applaud this game's writer for being able to express these ideas in a way that's not only faithful to Sonic, but also the original narrative, using the distinct nature of Sega's flagship character to elicit a new response from timeless characters. Merlina is the final major character in which Sonic's influence is made apparent. As a refresher, Merlina's ultimate goal is to make the Kingdom of Camelot and the land surrounding it immortal. She recognizes before anyone else the Knights of the Round Table, as well as Camelot, are doomed to fail, and believes her grandfather's conjuring of the King's Illusion was the incorrect solution to an immensely pressing issue. She summoned Sonic to her world and tasked him with defeating King Arthur so she could recover Excalibur's scabbard and grant herself enough power to enact her misguided plot, by basically petrifying her home. What a fucking story. What stands out to me about this character more than anything is her final interaction with Sonic, and what that says about the both of them as characters. It's a very quick and simple exchange, but I think it highlights exactly why Sonic is so enigmatic and Merlina the perfect conduit for connecting these two worlds. When you break her motivations down to their foundational elements, it becomes clear Merlina's entire character is rooted in fear and sorrow. She professes her plan is being enacted for the greater good of Camelot, but truthfully, this is her own twisted method of coping with her grandfather's demise, as well as the sobering reality she's destined to meet the same fate. I don't think she's a bad person per se, but simply a child struggling to process her pain. I mean, look at the way she talks down to Sonic at the start of the Dark Queen boss battle.
You would not understand, nor could you understand. That's why I must do what I must do. I am finished with you.
You will never understand me. This dialogue reeks of angst and confusion, man. The reason why Sonic's unable to understand your perspective is because you barely understand it, Merlina. I think that's why he continues to appeal to her humanity, even as she's attempting to murder him. She's just a kid who truthfully has no clue what she's doing. When you become as firmly rooted in your sense of self as Sonic, I think it becomes entirely blatant when another isn't. So, instead of talking down to her or declaring her to be incorrect, Sonic just shares his own perspective from their confrontation start to its conclusion. The prospect of death is terrifying and overwhelming, so Merlina isn't at fault for allowing its presence to get the best of her. However, it's also inescapable, so attempting to postulate ways of doing that is nothing but nonsense. From the moment you're born, you're just as susceptible as everything else to the crushing indifference of the nature of our universe. At times, it seems like the very environment you inhabit will stop at nothing to put you 6 feet under. That is simply a condition of existence. Nothing lasts forever. And that's okay, because there's beauty to be found in this impermanence. Life truly is what you make it. It will continue with or without you, so instead of ruminating in your own thoughts, experience the world to discover what makes you happy. It's a bummer when events don't unfold in your favor, but there's still so much ahead of you. Those moments of reprieve, where it seems like time comes to a standstill, and you're only left with yourself and the world around you, is genuine release. So diligently search for those moments. And don't let the larger intricacies and truths of our existence bog you down, because time waits for no one. Stay true to yourself and never stop moving forward. Because regardless of what happens and how that affects you, come the end of our reality, it all truly doesn't matter. Sonic and the Black Knight is a Sonic story unlike any other, because it really isn't a Sonic story. This is Merlina's tale, and what's so masterful about it is how the game's writer, Shiro Maekawa, structured it in a way that does justice to her character arc and the different realms it serves to bridge. Nonetheless, while it isn't necessarily his time in the spotlight, Black Knight still serves as a shining example of how to write for a character like Sonic. One of the more interesting tidbits of Sonic's development comes from Emu Emi's 27th anniversary charity live stream, in which Maekawa details how creating Sonic was kind of difficult, in the sense that when he was working on Sonic Adventure with Akinori Nishiyama, the way they created Sonic was that there's no drama around him, and that he's superhuman almost to where he doesn't have a weak point or an Achilles heel. So it was very difficult to create a story around that. Because of that personality, it became very difficult, you know? It's as I said before, folks. When a character is a symbol, dynamism cannot be applied to their character arc, because its static nature is meant to represent a larger abstract idea. I'd also like to express that when Meikawa says Sonic was written without flaws, he obviously doesn't mean it literally. Sonic has a lot of flaws. He's impatient and arrogant, to name a few. Although this may be true, we don't consider those traits to be flaws because Sonic's accepted them as a part of who he is, causing that impatience and arrogance to work to his benefit instead of his detriment. Sonic claimed his own freedom through accepting himself and the world around him for what they are, and Black Knight is a narrative built upon that principle. There's only one person who can save you from the restrictions in which you've placed upon your own reality. You. In addition, another aspect of this quote I'd like to draw attention to is how Meikawa expresses that Sonic is not an easy character to write for. If you place his character into the wrong hands, it will only result in a lackluster representation of a beloved icon, which is what we've been getting since 2010 with Sonic Colors. A writer must have the experience and skill to handle a personality as distinct as the Blue Blurs, and if anyone's proven they can do that, it's Meikawa. I would not have been able to gush about Black Knight's narrative for as long as I have if it wasn't handled with a seemingly excessive level of tact. Everything falls into place with this narrative, and as a writer myself, I recognize that if a work is this silky smooth, then the effort that went into accomplishing that was anything but. To give you an idea of what I mean, within Arthurian legends, King Arthur is almost consistently portrayed as a mythical and altruistic being, seemingly lacking any major flaws. Does that sound familiar? If you were to familiarize yourself with both the Sonic series as a whole and the story of King Arthur and the Knights of the Round Table, it becomes obvious the Sonic is King Arthur route was the only one to take. These two characters fulfill very similar roles within their own source materials, and so to basically weave them into one being upon being tasked with combining these two ideas is the mark of a seasoned writer. You have to be aware of the existence of those similarities in order to properly execute this kind of fusion. Otherwise, I'm sure it would have come off as a shitty fanfiction moment. It goes without saying that this is the level of quality I want to see from this series' writing. Black Knight is multi-layered and takes full advantage of the strange nature of what it is. You've got a truly special concept here with Sonic the Hedgehog Sega, so please start handling the series with the care it deserves.